Hi, everybody. This is Joe Lample, the Joe behind Joe Gardner, and welcome to the Joe Gardner Show. Today, we are kicking off something that I am really excited about. It's been a long time in the works. It's a new periodic series we're calling The Land Ethic in Action, created in partnership with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And in these episodes, we will explore stories where gardening, land, conservation, culture, and ecology all intersect. And I'll be joined for each one by Curt Meine, Senior Fellow of the Aldo Leopold Foundation, environmental historian, and the author of the definitive biography of Leopold himself. Together, we will talk with people who are at the creative edge of land care and stewardship, people whose work and ideas inspire us to think bigger about our own connections to the land. And this series is rooted in Leopold's belief that a land ethic evolves in the minds of a thinking community. We're talking with folks who are helping shape that ethic today, not just on farms and ranches, but in city parks, suburban yards, backyard gardens, and all the green spaces that we share. And our hope is that these conversations will inspire you to see your own space as living reflections of your values and your vision. And we couldn't ask for a better guest to launch this series than Darrel Morrison, a pioneer in landscape architecture whose work in prairie restoration, native plant design, and ecological education has literally influenced generations. And over his remarkable career, Darrel has taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the University of Georgia, the New York Botanical Garden, and more. His projects span from large-scale prairie and savanna restorations to intimate gardens, all guided by a deep understanding of native plant communities, and you'll hear that term a lot today. He's also the author of Beauty of the Wild, a life designing landscapes inspired by nature, which beautifully captures his philosophy and life's work. And joining us today, as he will always do for these series, is Curt Meine. Beyond his role at the Aldo Leopold Foundation, Curt has spent decades helping to carry Leopold's legacy forward, and he'll be adding his insight and perspective to enrich today's conversation and all the episodes to come. So let's get started with Curt Meine and our first official Land Ethic in Action guest, Darrel Morrison. I hope you enjoy. Well, this is a first and one that I have been looking forward to for a long time since, Curt, you and your colleagues at the Aldo Leopold Foundation suggested a format for a new type of podcast where we could periodically work together with this general topic of land ethic in action. And you would represent the Aldo Leopold Foundation with some of your esteemed resources, such as who we have today, Darrel Morrison, which I can't wait to talk to. I'm just really looking forward to us trying to work through this together with our shared knowledge of our guest. And I know you are there to enrich the conversation, and I look forward to digging in with Darrel. So Darrel, what a past you have, what an esteemed background. I am so thankful that Curt gave me an opportunity when we visited you in last August to meet and to get to know you. And I was so honored to have a personal tour of the Arboretum at the University of Wisconsin.
Sure.
And what a treat. So thank you again. Speaking of treats, thank you for being here today, because I want to talk to you more about some of that background, specifically as it relates to your work with prairies and ecological design. So let me stop right there and officially welcome you and have you say hello. So welcome and say hello.
Thank you very much. And welcome, everyone.
Okay, so I have a few questions for you, and I have to say, I was fortunate enough to have your book in my hand called Beauty of the Wild, a life designing landscapes inspired by nature. And have you ever spent your life, your professional life, doing exactly that? And what a beautiful book, and what an incredible story of your journey and your path through not only your childhood, but your evolution into your professional career, which was his, I don't know, 4 decades or more. Yeah. More. Yes, indeed. Okay. So that's a lot of me talking, and I want to hear about you, but I do want you to give us an overview of your childhood, because you opened up your book with giving us an insight into your childhood in Iowa. And it was fascinating to read that. So can I just get you to tell a little bit of that story in your early days and when you realized you had a connection to the land and to the environment and to gardening and design? Because that was early in your life.
Sure. Well, my book actually talks about people and places that influenced me, and certainly the place we started with, because it was called Our Place, the Morrison Place. The neighbors were the Mitchell Place and the McBride Place. So we were very conscious of place, I think, very early on. And that certainly had an influence. And I think even now, I think it is really important for designers of landscapes to reflect the place they're in so you know where you are when you are in a particular place. And I guess my career since 1967 has gone in that direction. I
Wow.
had a very traditional landscape architecture education at Iowa State, but let's go back to the beginning. I did grow up on a farm, 160-acre farm. There were four farms in a square mile, and there was a square grid all over Iowa, and everything was measured in terms of a mile east and 2 miles north, that sort of thing. And we used the direction a lot, but our place was really critical. And I guess probably one influence was that our parents gave each of their three sons our own little plot within the big vegetable garden. We could have our own little 10 by 10 square to do anything we wanted to with in terms of planting. And I started out very conventionally, little rows of radishes and lettuce and so forth, partly because they were so quickly rewarding. And then I got into planting patterns. I did circles and squares with my plantings. And then I was the unofficial gardener on our farm
You
for
were the self-appointed head gardener of your family by junior high.
right,
Pretty
right.
impressive.
Yeah. And in the winters, I would spend time poring over the Burpee seed catalog.
Yeah.
I had what to plant in the various borders and so forth. And that was really kind of the start of it. And I will mention also, my dad was a little disgruntled when I entered the Adair County Fair, the flower arranging contest, but I did that
Yep.
and kind of swept the show.
Yes, you did.
I used corn stalks and oats and various things with flowers, and happened to have a very tolerant or adventuresome judge who gave me a lot of prizes. So I was designing with plants very early.
Yeah, you were dominating those shows. You had a lot of wins at the Adair County Fair, right? And I know that your dad wasn't you were written up, there were articles, write-ups about you touting your big wins, and I know your dad read it, but he didn't really make
He
any
didn't
direct
say
comment, did
anything.
he? That's okay. So really interesting insights there. And you remind me a little bit of me in that in our young age and our reading the seed catalogs and so forth. But your career has spanned decades and really helped shape the field of ecological landscape design. Can you pin kind of a first event that drew you to native plants and natural landscapes as a foundation for your work?
Yeah, certainly. Well, when I graduated from Iowa State, I worked for a year or two as a landscape architect. And then I was drafted into the Army, and then I went to work for Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And my boss there, whose name was Joe Condis, had been a student to Penn State. And he had a teacher, John Bracken, who had him read a book called American Plants for American Gardens, co-authored by Edith Roberts, an ecologist, and Elsa Raymond, a landscape architect, and published in 1929. And Joe thought I might enjoy reading that book in 1962, and I did. I couldn't put it down.
Oh,
It's a wonderful book. And again, the linking of ecology with design with those two authors was a great model for me as well. But anyway, the book is a series of descriptions of different plant communities in the northeastern United States and how they could be incorporated into design, and beautiful poetic descriptions of those native communities. And so made me think I really need to know more ecology. I need to know more about plant communities, the dynamics of them. And at about that time, I decided to go back to school. This is 7 years after graduating with my undergrad degree in traditional landscape architecture. Very few species,
Right.
lots of ground covers and lawns,
Yeah.
hedges. Anyway, in 1967, I did go back to school, came back to school at the University of Wisconsin, and the prairie restorations here at the Arboretum, the first in the world, really stimulated me. I thought these beautiful compositions are designed by scientists, and and they're really beautiful. And we need to learn more science to back up our design. And I saw Curtis Prairie for the first time in 1967, about 32 years after it was planted.
Right.
So it was relatively young then, actually, but I was just totally taken by that and thinking, why don't we incorporate even elements of restoration in our designs for various sites? And again, I thought they're so beautiful, it's ridiculous not to use them. And then I've come up with lots more reasons to use them too. A big part of it being to express the sense of place where you are. And if you work with native plant communities in the region where you're working, then that is just the perfect beginning. And then I had, subsequent to that, I developed my 4 goals in landscape design. First, that it be ecologically sound, that it not require a lot of artificial inputs or imported inputs, that it not diminish natural diversity, so that it be ecologically sound. Secondly, that it be experientially rich. And I think there's absolutely no conflict between those two. Experientially rich relating to the aesthetics. The aesthetics are directly related to the composition which has evolved naturally in native plant communities. So ecologically sound and experientially rich and of the place, third goal. And finally, dynamic, that our design landscape should be permitted to change over time. And so that the landscape you see in 2003 will be different from one you see in 2010. I've certainly seen that at the Arboretum here because we planted the 4-acre native plant garden around the visitor center in 2002 and 2003. And now we're 20 plus years into that, and seeing the evolution is just wonderful. And the migration of plants within our plant community groupings. And I'm jumping into that whole subject, but the native plant garden here was just the perfect opportunity for me because while teaching at the University of Wisconsin, I started taking students on field trips to the point that we did a 3-week field course that I co-taught with an ecologist, Evelyn Howell, from 1973 until 84. And so I was in a lot of natural areas where we did field studies. We did meter square quadrats for herbaceous things. We did 100 meters quadrats for forests and savannas. And when you look that closely at at plant communities, you really you know them. Can't get it all from a book, but in the field you see the plants, you see the movement, and you smell the smells, and then you see it evolving over time too. And hence another of my goals, they're dynamic.
Yes. Darrell, I'm gonna jump in for 1 second because you've provided so much rich information already, and I feel like you've kind of looked at my outline because you're already getting into some of the areas I want you to dive into further
I didn't look.
as I lead into them. But I also want to acknowledge Curt Meine over here, who's by your side listening in on this, just nodding and smiling as you talk through these things. And Curt, I just want to ask you, as you're listening to this and reflecting back on your first introduction to Darrell or his association with what you have been involved with at the Aldo Leopold Foundation, tell us a little bit about that and some of the things that have wowed you in your time getting to know Darrell.
Yeah, Joe, thanks again for inviting me to join with you and chatting with Darrell here. Yeah, I'll tell you why I was nodding so much. And I think your listeners, I can help your listeners maybe to orient a little bit to why Darrell's been so influential and why he grew out of this place. And I'll go all the way back to where he started growing up on that farm in Iowa and describing those 160-acre squares that anyone who's flown over the middle continent knows. That's a artifact of the land survey that goes back to the first, and predates the United States, back
Mhm.
to the 1780s, when the laws were passed that implemented the land survey. Why am I going into that? It's because it was that very efficient mode of dividing land for private landowners to get a hold of that allowed us to wipe out the native prairie of North America so quickly.
Yes.
The richest soils on earth, and it was the destruction of the prairie. Iowa, covered by prairie once upon a time, pre-European settlement, it's almost all gone right now.
And
It's
can I just add to that? And you may already be going in this direction, but I want to make sure we talk about the fact that because those plants were so deep, literally deeply rooted into that soil, when people were trying to prepare the land for agricultural purposes, they were unable to uproot those plants until the invention of the metal plow.
John Deere.
John Deere
Yeah.
out of Illinois.
Yeah.
That allowed for
That was
the efficient
instrumental. Yeah.
destruction for
Right.
conversion to agriculture. And of course, a lot of great good came from that, but we also lost this immense diversity and productivity and fertility of our soils. We degraded our waterways. We've lost the habitats of who knows how many thousands of species. But that story, which could be a depressing one, actually takes a turn in the 1930s, right where Darrell and I are sitting right now, when just behind our backs, the very first experiments in prairie restoration were undertaken by Aldo Leopold and his contemporaries starting in 1934. And so we here in that's why I'm saying, for your larger audience outside the upper Midwest or Wisconsin, this place has played such an important role in the rethinking of our role in nature and of our capacity not only to cause harm, but to also begin to heal. And this place represents that. And Darrell was an inheritor of those earlier generations. I came along later. I'm a bit younger than my friend Darrell here, but the names he was mentioning are the same names that I knew when I was a student here in Madison and beginning to absorb sort of that legacy myself in later years. And so I got to know Darrell actually after he left Madison. I knew his work, but it was actually only when he retired back to Madison that we reconnected. And I got to appreciate the amazing arc of his career and how that arc really begins right here at this university and in the Midwest with our heritage of prairies lost and prairies regained.
You led into a great segue of what I wanted to ask you about to start kind of the main part of this conversation. And that was in 1934 when Aldo Leopold dedicated the Curtis Prairie at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. And correct me if I have any of my facts wrong, but I want to get this right. And the point of that was to, in Aldo's words, I think, tell about the origin story, and the goal was to basically reconstruct a sample of the original Wisconsin and specifically Dane County. But the reason for that is, and what I really want you to maybe expand on, is what makes prairies such a powerful landscape model, both ecologically and visually? Because I think, Darrell, you've already mentioned the kind of the aesthetics or the reference to that in some of your pillars, but let's give prairies their due in their significance ecologically and restoratively. And Curt, as you said, the devastation that took place when, the invention of the metal plow, and why this restoration, these efforts are so important.
Yeah. Let me do a lead in, and then I'm going to let Darrell
Yeah.
give you 5 seconds here to think through your answer. But I also want to make another point, that the loss of the prairie was also a loss to the people who were here before the Europeans arrived. The many different tribes in our particular area of Wisconsin, it was the Ho-Chunk Nation primarily. And we had Ho-Chunk people here, and we have always had our Ho-Chunk friends and neighbors living in this landscape. But at the time of the Arboretum, there were literally still folks from the tribe living on the lands of the Arboretum and hunting and gathering. So it's a theme that we've begun to, especially those of us from European cultures, begun in the last decade or so to really hone in on and to think about the deep implications of that. So I want to put that out there right away because that helped to inform this new mission here at the Arboretum. Literally the same day that Aldo Leopold spoke at the dedication, there was also an elder in the Ho-Chunk Nation by the name of Chief Yellow Thunder who spoke at the same event and talked about how his people had been, removed from the land and devastated in their cultures. And so the restoration that goes on here is biological, but it's also cultural. In fact, the term we sometimes use is biocultural restoration. So
Wow.
it goes hand in hand with the recovery of the plant communities and the animal communities is a recovery of the cultural knowledge, both indigenous and European, and the merging of those increasingly in our time. So I just wanted to add that in because that's such a critical foundation for the conversation as we go forward. And Darrell grew up where he grew up in Iowa at a time when, again, the removal of the native folks was pretty complete in Iowa. And the removal of the native vegetation was virtually complete too. And out of that, this fellow over here begins cultivating it literally a new vision for reconnecting people to place.
Yes.
And I might mention, I'm sort of moving back to my childhood briefly, and maybe you can work this in. But when I was growing up, obviously there were no big expanses of prairie. But on the farm where I grew up, there was a wet area along a creek. And my dad very wisely kept that with cordgrass in it because we used that to cover haystacks. But he knew enough to protect that and never plow that an acre along the creek, for example, because we needed the slough hay, or the rip gut grass, as it's called.
Yep.
It has very sharp edges.
Yes, it does.
And then the other thing was that on Highway 25 in front of our house, when I was young, there were wildflowers still growing, wild roses and monarda and many of the things that I've subsequently planted. But I think that had a big impact on me, knowing that there was that element of beauty remaining in the roadsides. And that changed when they started using all kinds of herbicides, mowing everything to the ground. But there was a remnant even as I was growing up.
Wow.
Must have been inspired by those little remnants, Joe. I don't know. I've lived in the East and I know that it's a different setting out there, but in much of the Midwest, you're not too far from finding even just a single plant growing that is a native plant in a ditch or on a fence row or wherever. And the imagination gets fired to know that this is a native plant in a very domesticated landscape.
Right.
And so having those remnants nearby has always been an inspiration to many of us who are Midwesterners.
So back to the question about the all the focus on these prairies and the native ecosystems that they provide and the powerful landscape model, both ecologically and visually. We have so few of them remaining, and the one at Madison is, to my knowledge, is it one of the few? Was that restored or was that created or
Restored, yeah. Mhm.
restored?
Well,
Yeah.
it had been pasture and farm field, I think, basically. So it was bringing back the vegetation that had been removed.
There were a few native plants still on the farmstead here. This was on the outskirts of the city of Madison. Now it's kind of surrounded by the city.
Yes, right.
Mhm.
And that's another part of the story here. But anyway, where the first restored prairie, the Curtis Prairie was pretty much a full reconstruction of prairie. And they did not have any model to go by. It was all, what do we do? Let's figure out how to get seeds and transplant plants and really starting from scratch. And yet you had to start somewhere because it was in fact the unraveling of the North American prairie that this is the Dust Bowl years. And that's a key part of the Dust Bowl story. Those great dust storms were made in part possible because of the loss of the native plant cover over such a huge portion of the continent.
Was it Aldo Leopold's vision to do that, or did he have kind of a idea planted in his head to do that?
Well, he had been very interested in the problem as a conservationist, as a forester, as a wildlife expert. He was very concerned with actually was soil erosion. And this was the crisis of its day. This was the climate change of its time, the loss of soil. It was an utter crisis across the continent. And so he tied together these threads as a conservationist, saying, if our civilization is at risk if we do not conserve and rebuild our soils. And so it was all part of the mood in the early 30s as the dust storms were flying. And Leopold, as an early ecologist, understood that in the Midwest of the US, prairie is where you have to turn not only for the literal materials, the plants and animals, but for the understanding of how native ecosystems survive, thrive, and perpetuate themselves and stabilize
Mm-hmm.
the world we live in, right?
Yes.
His idea, along with others here in Madison and beyond, was let's do something different. Every other arboretum in the world you go to visit and has trees and they got labels on them and you can learn your trees.
Japanese garden.
Here they had a revolutionary idea that, in fact, this arboretum would not just it has trees and it has ornamental things to learn about for the horticulturalists, and that's good, but it will have this crazy new vision of restoring, reclaiming the native plant communities of this area. And that was a revolution.
And many prairies are few in trees for a specific reason.
Some of the earlier people who came from the east wondered why there were not trees here, and they sort of thought the soil must not be very good because there were not trees growing, but it was actually because of the fires that had occurred, either naturally occurring or purposely started by a native population, because it stimulated the growth of the grasses, that sort of thing. So fire was certainly a part of it. And then the disturbance, in a sense, is taking fire away, and then you lose the prairie because it becomes very quickly vegetated with trees and shrubs. And so that unique landscape disappears.
Okay, so 1934 to 2025. How has the prairie managed to evolve? I think you mentioned evolution of a native landscape or a prairie over time in a previous part of this earlier part of the conversation. How has that prairie done compared to Aldo Leopold's vision of it in 1934 to where it is today? Have there been challenges to maintain it, or has it gone in the direction it was intended? Talk to me about, fast forwarding to today and looking back on Aldo Leopold's original vision and where are we compared to that today?
I guess that certainly the use of fire as a management tool has been critical, but even then there are cases of invasive species moving in and taking over areas, and that has to be checked in some way. So it's not easy by any means, but if you select the species that are matched with the microenvironment, then you've got a much better chance. And certainly in the native garden here, we have representation of the wet prairie, the wet mesic prairie, the mesic prairie, the dry prairie, and you match the species with that microhabitat, and that goes a long way toward making it more self-sustaining, so to speak. And plus it gives you additional diversity, because we had all the different plant communities to represent in the native plant garden, 400 species more or less. That means there's a lot more diversity, and so there's something to fill the appropriate niche, so to speak. Yeah. But I think for sure without burning, Curtis Prairie would not probably have made it.
Yeah, this is one of the first places, at least in this part of the country, where we began to understand fire not as a demon, but in fact a necessary part of the ecosystem. And this was again a revolution. You have to imagine, especially Leopold, who was trained as a forester,
Mhm.
and in his years of being trained in the early 20th century, fire was an enemy.
Yeah.
And as part of his evolution was to go from thinking of fire as a destructive agent to as a restorative agent. How we understand, of course, all across North America and beyond, how important that lesson, had we known 100 years ago what we know now. I want to bring up something that you both kind of jogged my memory to bring to the attention of your audience, Joe, and that is how this university was also a really important in these decades in the 1930s and beyond in the field of plant ecology and plant study of plant communities. It was one of the major centers for ecological research globally at that point. Some very innovative work that was done here to help us understand how plant communities form, how they perpetuate themselves, how we understand the complexity of them. In fact, Curtis Prairie is named after John T.
Yeah.
Curtis, one of the most important ecologists of the 20th century, who was a colleague of Leopold, a younger man, but who did so much to help us understand the nature of plant communities from an ecological standpoint. And that was built into this whole story of the Arboretum, and we should say not just here on the university campus, but it gave rise to a whole regional movement across the Midwest, in Chicago, across the entire region, in Kansas and beyond, for the people to understand that what we had taken for granted, this vast open prairie of the mid-continent, and that we had lost.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can begin the process of understanding, we lost not only the plants and animals, we lost the functions, the ecological functions. We lost the stability it gave to the soils and the waters. So this was part of the much larger story of how conservation was evolving in the mid-20th century. And this little place here, as well as Leopold's Shack, the second oldest restored prairie in the world, we think, how these became just early little seeds for rethinking our interaction with ecosystems more generally.
Darrell, in this whole discussion we're having right now about the Curtis Prairie and the introduction discussion about how it came to be and Aldo Leopold's vision for it, and you introduced the biggest part of this discussion about the prairie in your chapter called Merging Ecology with Design. 33 years later, from the time that Aldo Leopold dedicated the prairie, you're out there doing field studies and different research. And then 30 years after that, I believe, you were invited back to the university to design and create the native plant garden overlooking the prairie, right?
1997. Yep.
That had to be kind of surreal to incorporate so much time into circling right back to such a significant event from 34 to, you're working in the field trials to 30 years later, you're designing the native plant garden.
Yeah. Going back initially to the beginning of my teaching career at the University of Wisconsin, I was teaching a course called Planting Design, terms I don't really like, but anyway, I was doing that. And so I brought students to the Arboretum, and we did drawings, we did the quadrat studies, we really got to know the prairie up close and personal. And then I, in addition to the field classes, in my design classes, a typical student assignment would be to design a small dry prairie garden or design a wet prairie garden, and relatively small scale space-wise. And nobody had done that before, I think. And it just seemed so logical to me that we would look at the natural model and then match it up with the microhabitat on a site to be designed, and then think even about the patterning of the vegetation. The species might be aggregated, highly grouped, or they might be very loosely aggregated, or they might be randomly spaced. And you learn that for the different species, which ones tend to be highly aggregated and those that tend to be more widely spaced. And then you can you can emulate that in design versions of it. So you can get the spirit of that particular prairie if you put it on the right site. And that was really great education for me as well as my students, I think. Yeah.
And was that, this is going to be a bad pun and it's not intended either, but the word that comes to mind, was that groundbreaking design principles at that point? I mean, were people already designing or working on prairie design before you started doing it as well? Or was that something that you just you had this vision to go forward with that.
I think I can safely say they were not doing before.
Yeah. That's why I asked you, because I mean, you recognize the significance and the value of the prairies and
Mm.
how much we had lost of them in many years prior, but that became kind of a thread or a theme to you, at least as far as the ecology and design, with kind
Right.
of all your work going forward across the country with all the various roles that you played, if I have that right.
And not to be lost in this is the beauty of it,
Yeah.
the sheer beauty of it.
Yes.
And Leopold has a great quote about people first learn to value nature through the pretty, and then you can move on to whole
Yeah.
new levels of understanding, which I really appreciate that because it is so true. And I saw it with my students in the field. We go into a prairie like Avoca Prairie, 2,000-acre one, west of Madison, and people are just kind of overwhelmed by it at first. And then you start to study the distribution patterns. You see the beauty of that, and it's all because it's responding to the environment and matched up with it, and it really is beautiful.
Mm.
And
I'm going to interject here because that question and Darrell's answer makes me think of how that represents a larger evolution going on in the whole way we think about landscapes. And I'm going to bring in another historic name here that maybe your listeners don't know, but is well known to us here in Wisconsin. That's Jens Jensen.
Mm-hmm.
He was contemporary of Aldo Leopold's, who did focus on native plants in his early landscape architecture design. And some of these are still with us, very well known in Chicago and other parts of the Midwest. But what he didn't get to, and this is where Darrell comes in, is it isn't just the individual organisms and their prettiness, because many of these plant species are very pretty. But Darrell takes it to that next level of thinking about not just the individual plant, but how that particular species occurs in the native landscape of a prairie or a savanna or other types of ecosystems. So that what Darrell was taking to the next stage of thinking and development and application beyond just the individual pretty organism to the patterns and the evolutionary rightness of the way you plant things together and how they occur in nature. That was the ecological part that Jensen, just due to his time in history, had not yet.
Yeah. Too short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, and I like to see the progression with students. First, they see the pretty plants, and then they start to see patterns, and then they can think about the processes that lead to the patterns. And then beyond that, you can start to think about preserving and restoring those into a designed landscape. And it's a progression.
It seems so logical that you would need to know those things in order to replicate that with the proper plants, depending on where you're making those or placing those designs. And yet I think the focus on pretty sometimes dominates. And what you're talking about is such an important part of it for longevity and appropriateness.
But it does start with the pretty, people recognizing something that's pretty.
Yeah. I
And-
guess
but-
people don't want an installed landscape that I guess isn't perceived as pretty.
But then beyond that, too, one sees beauty in the movement, the wave-like action
Yes.
of the prairie, and that isn't replicated by ornamental plants generally.
And you've done such a nice job showing us in this book, again, that I referenced, Beauty of the Wild, with pictures from all over where you've been and gardens that you've designed. And you have quite a history in your career of some pretty esteemed appointments and positions. Can you give us a little bit of the timeline from when you were a student at the University of Wisconsin to your professional career?
Sure. Well, I graduated with my master's degree in landscape architecture in 1969. Started teaching at Wisconsin that year, actually, and then very early on, the first project I designed was for an insurance company in Madison. First project that featured 2-acre prairie at insurance company in Madison,
Huh.
CUNA Mutual, and it was radical. it really was radical for people, because the people at CUNA would get observations like, "Hey, your lawnmower break down, you're not mowing your lawn," or others who actually thought it was pretty.
Yeah.
But I did that, and then that led to a much larger project, about 80 acres for the General Electric Corporation at a site between Madison and Milwaukee, where I designed and then oversaw the installation of the 80-acre prairie. And then that just kind of led from one thing to another. But that was the beginning, those two projects, especially the insurance company, because it hadn't been done.
And as much time as you spent between Iowa and Wisconsin and in that region of the country, you came down to my parts for 20 years at the University of Georgia. You had a pretty important job there too. Tell us about that.
Well, which part of it?
Well, your letter inviting you to be Dean of Environmental Design, for one.
I was invited to apply, and
Okay.
I did apply, but I thought there was no way I would be selected. I was sure they already had the candidate, and they had to go through the formality, interviewing other people. Lo and behold, they hired me. And but I like to think I influenced that program a lot, bringing the native plant element into it in the native plant communities. And even when I was dean, I was teaching a field class in southern plant communities, and I co-taught with the scientists again, Sam Jones, who was a taxonomist. And to me, that's really critical, that I needed somebody, a scientist, to work with in that environment, like Evelyn Howell at Wisconsin, because you just really need both inputs. And I was dean there for 9 years, 10 years, and then I, quote, went back to the classroom and taught until 2004, when I, quote, retired.
Yeah. Or moved on to something else.
Retired upwards, yes.
Yes.
And when I, quote, retired from teaching at Georgia, I moved to New York City. Actually,
Relax, right, Darrell?
Actually, I had thought about moving back to Wisconsin and building a little shack on land that I had purchased in 2002.
Mm.
Beautiful hillside prairie, actually, with a flat plain at the bottom. But anyway, instead of moving there, I moved to New York City for something a little different. And I had the great privilege of working with New York Botanical Garden, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, Storm King Art Center, projects that I really enjoyed so much, and which have had an impact, I think, in showing people in that part of the world that you can draw on your native communities.
Yep.
And it can be beautiful.
Yes.
And
And you gave great examples of that throughout your book too. Really beautiful examples. But you took a liking to New York. You kind of liked the vibe and the hustle and the bustle. And
it was great,
yeah.
but it was time to come back. So in 2016, I guess I came back. That's when I met you.
I'd like to kind of interject that, on this trajectory through your life and career, Darrell, you were imprinted on the prairie and the Midwest and the landscapes and organisms here. And then we send you off to humid southern southeast in Georgia and a very different ecosystem. And then obviously up to New York. But was it easy to transfer the lessons of ecological design? Did that come to you like intuitively, or did you have to sit down and think about it and say, well, I'm not in Kansas anymore?
I had to work with people who knew more than I did,
Yeah.
which is important, I think, to recognize that. But even before Georgia, I did work in Texas at Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And there I worked directly with David Northington, who again was a plant scientist. And we spent time in Texas looking at the natural communities, and that helped to inspire what I did there. Plus, I worked with a local firm that had people who understood Texas better than I did.
Can I ask an irreverent question, Joe?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of this trajectory. We're going through the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, and we think of that period as the time of nice, clean lawns with nice, clean white picket fences and standardized and commercialized nurseries selling us all these things that didn't grow there originally. And all of a sudden you're planting things, Darrell, that are a little ragged,
Yeah.
unkempt, and people aren't used to seeing them. And we have, and we still, of course, obviously to this day, have restrictions on what you can plant in lawns and communities everywhere.
That's the truth.
What was it like to be proposing that you should let things just loosen up and grow? What was that like
That was
to
exciting.
tell
Living
us?
on the edge there.
I was pretty dissatisfied with the status quo, and I couldn't just be quiet. Had to demonstrate alternatives to that. And the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, for example, had demonstration plots where you could show different plant communities distilled into small squares, so to speak. And so that would be one way. And most of all, working with public gardens, you can show people possibilities that they don't know exist. And people might think, oh, there's no way we could do that, but then they can see it demonstrated. And to me, that's one of the big roles of botanical gardens, is to show people possibilities that they didn't know exist previously. And that's certainly true at the garden we're gazing out on here. It's all native, I mean, and no chemicals used in its planting and development, no irrigation, and so it's shown as a very sustainable demonstration of what you can do. And so I think that's really important, to show people what can be done. And to me, it doesn't look ragged. But
Well, and Joe, this is something to highlight about Darrell and his work. And this place where we happen to be recording right now is knowledge of native plants and plant communities. It's been frayed over the generations. People don't know, even in the Midwest, what a prairie is. And it was the same for me growing up, and this is common. When I was growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, a prairie was the empty lot in the housing development next door.
Oh,
But it had nothing to do with the actual plants and animals that we would call a prairie. And so the educational value of this type of approach to landscaping, gardening, and conservation, and that's a major part of the mission of the Arboretum here in Madison. But it's also been such a key part of what Darrell has brought to his clients, to people visiting the gardens and plantings that he's created, just to familiarize ourselves with those things that are inherent in the places we live, to develop that sense of place that Darrell's been talking about.
and something I really stress is the importance of field study for designers in looking at native communities as a model for designed ones, designed gardens, designed landscapes. I look for the dominant species that occur in that community. These are typically the largest plants. The forest, it's the trees, but in a prairie, it's the large tall grasses, big blue stem, so forth. You look for the dominant species, then you look for the abundant species, those that occupy the most of the area. And then I have a third category, which I call the visual essence species, those which are characteristic of a particular habitat. And then that's transferable wherever you go. If you study the natural models where you go, then you can look for those species and you can get the essence of a community. Jens Jensen himself said, we can't copy nature, but we can distill nature. And that's what I like to think I do. I distill the natural model in a designed form, trying not to oversimplify too much.
and that's a natural model of a prairie,
Right.
basically.
And certainly those field classes I taught in Wisconsin led me to hillside prairies and wet prairies and intermediate prairies. And you do get a feel for it.
I'm going with my instinct here.
Mhm.
Okay.
I'm thinking of Little Blue Stem right now. So I don't know how much, it depends on where your listeners are, Joe. Some of them are going to be Midwesterners or Westerners who know Little Blue Stem, this clumped species of the drier end of the spectrum of prairies. But I remember encountering that when I was living and working in Washington, D.C. at one point. There's a little blue stem out there. You're at the way far east end of its range there, but I felt so at home seeing the little blue stem. And you can also find it all the way up out west up to the Rockies, although it's a little too dry out there for most little blue stem. But having that connection to a species and knowing and seeing it in its different parts of its range, and then seeing that we're in a drier prairie here in Wisconsin, and boy, is there anything more beautiful in the fall than little blue stem? You know, when it turns its purplish red,
Mm.
it just that visual power that comes through in an open prairie, and you have to be a Midwesterner maybe to have some sense of that. But
Although,
what do you think?
well, there is a great natural model, or there was on Long Island, 60 acres on the Hempstead Plain was prairie, basically,
Yeah.
tall grass prairie. And most of that, like the prairie in the Midwest, was removed when development occurred.
Yeah.
Right now, there's, I think, 38 acres of the 50,000 remaining on Long Island. But there's a big movement on Long Island to try to restore it also. A lot of acreage on roadsides, for example, on Long Island. So they're working on it, but it's very hard when there's so little remaining there. And that another important thing that we should be always doing, and that is to protect those remnants where they do occur so that we have some models, and that gets lost sometimes as well. And I had personal experience with that where I had 20 acres in, quote, the driftless area in southwest Wisconsin, where I had thought I might build a cabin at one point. And then I decided instead to turn it over to the Driftless Area Land Conservancy. And I'm so glad I did that, because now those 20 acres are pretty much protected forever. And that is really exciting, because people then can have something to look at as the model for land designed situations.
This leads me into a question that sets up the last few questions I want to ask you. And it pertains to looking forward and relevance to people listening to this podcast today. First of all, I have a few questions here, so maybe I'll bundle them and you can kind of pick them apart and choose what order you want to answer them in. But thinking in terms of somebody listening, thinking, gosh, I really want to I totally recognize the value of native plants. I really like what I'm hearing about prairies. I want to do more to create that sort of environment, to do my part to maybe be restorative of that. But I'll stop right there with this question. What are some of the challenges and rewards of ecological restoration? I think we know some of the rewards from what you've already talked about. But again, let's revisit the challenges. And is a prairie, no matter where we are in the U.S., for example, since most of the audience is North America, could that be appropriate wherever we live, as long as we chose the proper plants? Or are there cases where prairie really isn't probably the best scenario for a particular environmental?
Yeah, good question. And brings up something I'll just mention parenthetically. I gave a lecture at Georgia once, which I was showing work I had done in Texas and Montana and the Northeast. And one of my students very legitimately asked the question, how can you know enough about all those places to design there? And my answer, which I still believe, is I work with people who know more than I do about that place. And so that's critical if you're working in a big geographic area. Well, then his next question was, then why did they hire you? But then I put it together.
Because then you come in with your natural model for the prairie, the dominant, abundant, and visual essence. You put those pieces together.
But those same categories exist in the forest and in the savanna. The dominant species, the abundant species, the visual essence species. So you adapt to the region you're in. And I don't like the idea of planting a Midwestern prairie in the east. There's certain species that are appropriate, and certainly Long Island had lots of them. But I do think we should respect the place we're in and not have a collection of plant communities from all over.
Right.
And even in the Midwest, Joe, the prairie that would have grown where I live in a very, very dry, sandy place is completely different
Yeah.
from the prairie that would have been 10 miles away on a rich, loamy soil. So the idea here is not to replicate a prairie. The idea is to learn about, understand, and appreciate the native plant community of wherever you are. And that could be anything from a Sonoran desert to the Pacific Northwest rainforest, to the oak savannas of the Midwest, to the boreal forest of northern Maine, or wherever. So, it's not about adhering to the particular ecosystem, and it's to celebrate all our native ecosystems wherever we are, and to bring back some of the elements that have been lost. We can't replicate any of the ecosystems that we have had a negative impact on. But what we can do is restore some of the diversity, functions, beauty, and cultural connections anywhere we live.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess this is a question maybe I should have put at the top of the show, but based on Curt, what you just said, and Darrell too, I think we should just give us a clear definition of what defines a prairie. And then how's that different from a meadow, by the way? I know I get that question a lot. And can prairies be anywhere in the US as long as you're using the appropriate plants for that region?
Let me start, Darrell,
do.
and then I want to see how you react to what I say.
Oh, God.
So prairie of course, it's a French word, and it came from the French coming into the mid-continent and seeing these large open expanses. And it actually, if I'm not mistaken, means meadow in
Right,
French.
Exactly.
So it's the French word for meadow. It's the closest thing they had in that part of Europe to something like they had never seen before.
Oh.
For our native Ho-Chunk neighbors, it was Mosca. It was the name for the grassland. So what we really need to think about is where the climate and topography and soils create grasslands. They're extensive in the mid-continent, but in even very wet places, you're going to have drier spots that would have supported more grasses than forest or savanna, perhaps. So you can go to Georgia and climb up to the top of the Appalachians to one of those balds, as they call them, east, and find grassy areas. So it's this fine, interesting ecological, reality that developed over the millennia in North America, if not even older, millions of years actually, that gave us the native diversity that we inherited. And that we have before we understood what ecology even meant, that we very quickly unraveled. And now it's such a new science. It is only less than 100 years old where we begin to think about reweaving some of these systems and getting back some of the benefits that we so easily lost. So no, it's maybe grasslands is a little more generic way of thinking about the plant communities dominated by grasses and related forbs that would grow with the grasses. And that's common in many ecosystems and bioregions across the continent.
The last thing I would want to do is to homogenize everything so it all looks alike. And I would only plant prairie where it is really legitimate, probably in the region where it originally occurred. And I do have a practical definition or differentiation between meadow and prairie.
Perfect.
And my view is that a meadow is an opening in the woods. And that can happen in the east, for example. The roundhouse that I designed in Connecticut, or the landscape that I designed in Connecticut, that's a meadow because it's an opening in the woods. But the prairie goes to the horizon.
Oh, wow.
And you can't necessarily plant to the horizon, but you can give the sense of that.
But what Darrell's getting at here is it's true in many, even most forest ecosystems. They are dynamic, just like a prairie is dynamic, just like a desert or a wetland are dynamic. In most forested ecosystems, you're going to have disturbances, right? Tree fall, wind throw, fire that are going to open up your forests. And there are species in those ecosystems adapted to take advantage of when an opening occurs.
Yep. Yes.
So what Darrell's talking about in mimicking native ecosystems and design is simply to ask, what are the species that filled that role ecologically, historically?
Early successional, yeah.
And how can we creatively use them in our distilled design ecosystems that we enjoy in our own places? So that's what's totally cool to me about all this is it's recognizing the ecological evolutionary makeup and patterns in
Yes.
them, and then saying, wow, how can we mimic, use, honor those processes and plants and the animals that come with the plants to create them in a different way in harmony with what nature would have produced in that particular region.
Yeah. I might mention a project that's in the book, namely the granite outcrop garden at the Museum of History in Atlanta that I designed back in the early 1990s. And then they expanded the building and took out my granite outcrop.
Oh, wow.
But the good news is they saved the parts, and Trees Atlanta at their headquarters in Atlanta has built the same landscape on their site,
Oh, nice.
which is an open site like a granite outcrop.
Mm.
And granite outcrops are great openings in the Southeast.
And, you know, since we're on this particular topic, I just want to mention, you know, we who grew up or were educated here in the upper Midwest, prairies are a part of the way we learn, you know,
Yeah.
the legacy of conservation in this region. But I've been so pleased to see in the Southeast U.S., there's been quite a movement to protect the remnants and restore the native grasslands of the Southeast. It's really quite a movement, and several friends and colleagues of mine I know have been leaders in that movement, and there's books out now. And so we're seeing what we went through here in the upper Midwest spreading to other regions. And so that's been really gratifying to see. It's not just quirky prairie people here in the Midwest. It really is. And you can see the same thing going on with native grasslands and other ecosystems elsewhere.
The longleaf pine savanna in the South is a great model for a lot of purposes, and because it is a grassland with trees, but it's absolutely beautiful. There's one near Thomasville, Georgia, called the Big Woods,
Yep.
which I loved, and part of it is because it has the grassy understory, a very diverse one, the most diverse community in the Southeast, with maybe 30 species per square meter.
And we should say that there's a direct historic connection between the Arboretum and Aldo Leopold and the tall timbers, Thomasville part of the Southeast, where they began back in the 1920s, 100 years ago, began to say fire is necessary for these ecosystems to replicate. So there was a fellow back there, his name was Herb Stoddard. He's worth a whole program in itself. This kind of amazing, almost savant. He understood with very little formal training that we needed fire to restore those longleaf forests and pinelands of the Southeast. And Leopold and he were very close friends. And it was the work in the Southeast that helped Aldo Leopold to understand fire is not your enemy. So there's really fascinating historical connections in all these stories as well. And so in any of this, we're reclaiming the processes, constituent plants and animals, but we're also seeing the story of how people came to understand the dynamics of their own places. The Europeans who came here did not have an understanding. It's taken generations. We still got a whole long way to go. And we are turning back to indigenous knowledge systems for whom fire was a fundamental reality and tool.
Yes.
Learning again that cultural fire as it developed in North America is you can't understand our landscapes without it.
Okay, 3 final questions. And one is just to back circle a little bit to design choices, but here's how I would phrase this. Darrell, because again, people are hoping to get their questions answered that they're thinking to themselves as they listen, and that is, what advice do you have for the landscape designers or the home gardeners who want to try to incorporate native prairie elements into their own spaces?
Native prairie elements could be grasses, but I would choose grasses that are regionally
Okay.
native, not necessarily Midwestern
Right.
grasses.
Of
Uh,
course. Yes.
And in the Southeast, for example, there's a grass called purple love grass that is a fantastic plant for people who want a soft pinkish
Yeah.
haze for the ground. And I met that in Georgia for the first time and love it, and people love it in general. There's that, and then there are any number of other things. And again, looking at granite outcrops where they're hot, exposed sites, those become models for paved areas in the city, and where you have reflected heat. So you can look to a natural model again that has characteristics of the design, the design site,
Yep.
but let's not put prairies everywhere.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. And that's worthy. That's worth noting for sure, because there's there are appropriate places for that and then not. Okay. Here's 2 fun questions for you to wrap it up.
Okay.
Darrell, you've influenced generations of students, designers, and land stewards. What have you given thought to what you hope will be your lasting legacy in the world of ecological design?
I guess helping students to understand the importance of not destroying diversity in their own work. Anytime that a design landscape diminishes the diversity of the site that might have been there previously, that's going in the wrong direction. But to value all species that belong that were there before we were, and keep a place for them, and certainly protecting existing natural areas is high on the list, because once they're gone, you can't really replicate them totally. So to me, if that message sinks in, I'll be happy.
Yeah.
And I'll be very happy. I do think of the garden we're sitting in now is a legacy of sort. Because it, people ask me, has it lived up to my expectations? I said, no, it exceeds them. Thanks partly to Susan Carpenter,
Yeah.
the gardener, curator, but just to value species diversity.
Yep.
And to recognize the beauty of that is what I hope.
Joe, I want to add something here too, because the way you phrased the question prompts me. Let's be upfront about this. We're heading into a period of great uncertainty and disruption in the way we live within our world and in our ecosystems. And we can't ignore the realities of climate change. And so there's a very interesting and important debate going on of how do we even think about that? What's native? How are we going to respond to the changes coming at us? And the way I've come to think about that myself is, look, I'm going to put my bet on the things that have survived for thousands and thousands of years since the ice ages. They've been through cycles of change and adaptation. And we don't know exactly what this world is coming to, but if I had to put my bets, I'm going to say, let's keep that diversity, because that lends resilience. And we are going to need resilience going forward in all of our places, whether we're in an urban environment, suburban environment, rural environment, agricultural, wild places, everywhere across that spectrum from the city to the wild places. We're going to have to find resilience. The best bet for that is not to worry about trying to engineer our way out of the problem, but to help the systems we live in and with to bring forward their own ways of defending them and themselves and restoring themselves, which is the native plant diversity of your place, along with the native soils, hydrology, and other features of that place. So Darrell's work, and I'm thinking back here, before we got on the air, Joe,
Yeah.
this fellow over here told me he's getting ready to attend his 70th high school reunion. So and the last thing I want to offer in this session together is going back to thinking of Darrell, you on that farm out there in southwestern Iowa and seeing a little bit of native vegetation and that setting you off on a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
Now you're getting ready to go back for your high school reunion.
Yeah.
When you pause and breathe and think about this big journey and how it's been intrinsically woven through with the plants that you have come to love and respect. What goes through your head as you're getting ready to go back home for this big event? What are you thinking about? Are you going to go back and find some of those native prairie plants?
I don't think they're there. I think they chemically remove them along the roadsides. I used to see there are a tiny number of remnant prairies in Iowa, but it's 1/100th of 1% of the original prairie. Let me go back to the climate change thing briefly. One thing that working both in the South and the North has been useful for me is that I can think of plants that are common to both environments. For example, white oaks and red oaks grow fine in Georgia. They can be used here too because they're native here too. So we can look for those possibilities. But most importantly, as Curt says, protecting the diversity wherever we are is really critical because for the resilience that they provide. And once they're gone, they're gone.
Yes. All right. So, go ahead.
But once they're restored, they are here and we can continue to keep to walk with them into the future. That's when I look out at the garden we're looking at out the door here. That's what I see in that garden is I've been here now a dozen times with Darrell and I see something different and we are moving forward together as in Leopold's word, as a whole community of soils, water, plants, animals, and people. His definition of land. And we are all part of that community going forward into this uncertainty in the future.
You know the quote, I'm sure very well, from Leopold about the thing is right when it preserves the integrity, stability,
and beauty of the biotic community.
Yep.
That may be the wrap up right there, but I'm going to ask this question anyway, just in case, because I better have it, not need it, than need it, not have it. But to both of you, this question applies. I would love to hear what gives you both hope when it comes to native landscape restoration and our cultural relationship to wilderness and place.
That's the big one. You saved it for the last, Joe. Well, I'm going to let Darrell have the last word because he's our special guest. But, it's the word hope is a very complicated word. And I've had long conversations with some very deep thinkers on the complexities of that word. Some people think hope is not helpful because it doesn't imply action. It just implies, we're just going to sit back and hope for the best.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I have friends who say hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. If you do not have action along with it, it's not, you have to have action that goes along with it. And that's what thinking about native plant communities and plant and animal ecological communities, it gives you orientation. That's my word of the kind of the decade for me is how do we orient ourselves amid change? Well, it goes back to our previous conversation or question that we just talked about. And when you have access to native plants, it isn't just access to the pretty plant. It is access to the story of the place. So when I walk out my door where I live and I see prickly pear at my feet, what? Cacti in Wisconsin? It's because I live in this dry, sandy place along the Wisconsin River and it gets really hot on summer days like we're having right now. But I see that prickly pear and I think, wow, think of how that species got to Wisconsin over thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah.
Think where that species is going to be going in the future, whatever the future holds. So native plants aren't just about the plant. They're about the story of our millennia of adaptation on the land, plants, animals, and people. And so the hope comes from understanding we're part of a much larger, longer story And we can be a positive part of that when we choose to be. And we can find ourselves and ground ourselves and orient ourselves through these companions in our landscape.
Nice.
Yeah, I would only say, I think we've got to have hope. And if we didn't have hope, we wouldn't do anything. But hope needs to be matched with action. And Curtis Prairie would never have happened if they hadn't hoped they could do it. And so I think that's really critical. But speaking of prickly pear, I do have to tell you one little short story. I did the native plant garden at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which includes representations of the pine barrens of Long Island and New Jersey, for example. And in that is prickly pear cactus.
Yeah.
And I integrated into my design then plants that grow in the pine barrens, including prickly pear. And I was standing right outside the garden one day, and a school group was coming by, and I was talking to ASLA members about the garden design. And they said, it just warms my heart to think that a Brooklyn child can see prickly pear cactus in Brooklyn, a block off Flatbush Avenue. And lo and behold, without any planning on my part, a father and son, little 5-year-old kid came in, and the little kid said, "Look, Daddy, a cactus."
Yeah.
That gives me hope.
Yeah. You wrote in your book you were so encouraged by that enthusiastic response.
Yeah.
Understood. Well
And,
said.
and I mean, one has to have hope whenever you take on a landscape project that you can make it work.
It's that too. That too. Well, you've certainly proven that time and time again, Darrell. Thank you
Thank you.
so much to you and Curt for this opportunity to talk to you both. And such an honor to be able to ask you these questions and pick your brain about what you know and your wisdom too. So thank you both. Well, that's a wrap for our first episode of The Land Ethic in Action. And a big thank you to Darrel Morrison for sharing his wisdom, and to Curt Meine for helping us connect the dots between Aldo Leopold's legacy and the work being done today. This series is about listening to the people who are shaping the land ethic in their own ways through design, restoration, teaching, and hands-on stewardship. But our hope is that these conversations will spark new ideas for how you can bring that ethic to life in your own spaces, whether that's a backyard garden or a community plot or maybe a larger landscape. But we'll be back here with more episodes in this series featuring voices from across the spectrum of land care and conservation. But until then, I hope that you'll look at the land around you and the way that you can care for it as your own portrait of what matters most. Thanks for watching. And if you're not already, consider subscribing and tap that notification button too, so that you will never miss an episode, because I'll be back here again soon for more podcast episodes, DIY, and how-to videos also, and I'll see you again soon.